All right, guys, because we know next year is going to be completely different in terms of the playoff picture, I wanted to maybe give a little bit of a hypothetical preview to what we're going to be, discussing next year when it comes to the massive expansion of the playoff to 12 teams with the top 4 teams getting buys. How will that all set up in relations to, what if it was happening this year? And I made this little, tournament bracket here. It has the top 4 teams, all conference champions getting buys, and just a little hypothetical thing I thought it would be fun to run through as we enter week number 9. And then I also want to look at the potential teams on the outside looking in that could still have a chance to make a theoretical 12-team playoff. So you could see right now I do have Michigan at number 1 overall. This would be them winning the Big Ten. I do think they're current favorites. They would be facing either Oregon or Alabama. And that Oregon-Alabama game would be played in Eugene. It would be an 8v9 game. You can argue, should Alabama be ranked, right now, 8th, 9th, 10th, whatever. They do have a lot of big wins. Oregon, on the other hand, they've got that one tough loss to Washington, but the winner would take on Michigan in the second round, and that game would be played at a neutral site. The first round is on-campus games. The higher seed gets to host. The second round's at a neutral site. The number 4 seed would be Florida State right now because they are in the ACC undefeated currently. We would expect them to win the ACC, even if they somehow slip up. As long as they win the ACC championship with 1 loss or no losses, they're very, very likely going to make the playoff because they have that non-conference win. The neutral site win against LSU. As long as LSU keeps winning, they would take on Ohio State or Air Force. Now, when it comes to the actual rules, I do believe, based on the current rules that we have, the number 5 seed would have to be another conference champion. You have Ohio State there, which obviously would not be correct, but it would probably be Oklahoma. Either way, I do think Ohio State is the best team right now that would not be in, the buys because of the format with only 1 team from each conference getting that bye, the conference champion. Ohio State in this scenario would lose to Michigan, finish the regular season 11-1, and then be the best team out of the buys. They would face Air Force, who would be the group of 5 team. And you could really sub in if Air Force loses a game. SMU would be another team that could make it. Tulane would be another team, but they would be traveling to Columbus, and the winner would take on FSU in the second round. And then you would get possibly, Michigan versus Florida State, Michigan versus Ohio State, Alabama versus, Florida State, something like that in the semifinal game. Moving on to the bottom side of the bracket, you can see Texas and Penn State would be facing off. The winner would face the number 2 seed, Georgia. Certainly Georgia, I'm not expecting them to lose a regular season game, but it wouldn't surprise me based on how they've played, based on, facing teams like Missouri, like Tennessee. It's possible they could lose with the big injury to their tight end. And you're taking a look at a team like Texas and Penn State. Penn State coming off a loss, Texas coming off a tough game against Houston. That game would be in Texas, and it would certainly be intriguing. And I really wish we had the 12-team playoff. It's just so great. It's more meaningful football. That's what you want. It is more of an NFL-style format with the buys, with more teams. And then you do also have Washington right now set up, potentially getting a bye through the first round, facing either Oklahoma or Notre Dame. Yes, I do actually have Notre Dame in the playoff right now based off of their resume. They beat USC, they beat Duke, they've had some tough games, they lost to Ohio State in a game they very easily could have won, probably should have won, and then they do have the brutal loss against Louisville, but even with that, I would probably put them in. Obviously, at this point, you could definitely make the argument, how do you have Notre Dame in front of Louisville? Louisville crushed them head-to-head. I think that needs context. I think Notre Dame overall, if they faced again, neutral site, Notre Dame with legitimate rest. They were coming off 2 straight games or primetime games. I think it might have been 3 straight primetime games. It was crazy. Oh no, it was 2 straight because they faced USC after. But either way, I would have Notre Dame in, and that's kind of the format where it would set up, and it would be like a Washington versus Oklahoma or Washington versus Notre Dame in the semifinal in terms of that. Now, when it comes to the bigger picture of this, just taking a look at the analytical rankings right now, you can see Ohio State, Penn State, and Michigan all would feel like, I would say, locks to make a 12-team playoff. The only way it doesn't happen is if Penn State Ohio State or Michigan lose to someone that's not in that round robin. Like Penn State could very easily lose to Michigan at home and still make a 12-team playoff as the 11 seed, because they would have a really good resume, they would have really good analytics, they would still be 10-2. You could also argue, because Penn State's non-conference schedule wasn't very good, maybe they might miss out even at 10-2 with their only 2 losses coming to Ohio State and Michigan. That's something to think about as well. But if Ohio State ends the regular season losing to Michigan, not making the Big Ten championship, they would still be a virtual lock, probably as the number 6 seed to make the playoff, just because it is expanded now. And then you do have Oklahoma sitting at 7-0 right now. So Oklahoma is kind of an interesting case. Let's say they lose to Oklahoma State and then they lose to Texas. They're a 2-loss team at that point based on their schedule within the Big 12. Would they make the playoff? I would say probably, as a 2-loss team with a win against Texas. Also, they would have a win against Kansas. They would probably still make it. Alabama sitting with 1 loss at this point. They have big games remaining. I think if Alabama, in a 12-team hypothetical format, they might actually be able to lose 3 games depending, because they do have a very hard schedule. They had that early season loss to Texas. They faced a tough non-conference opponent, and they also have big conference wins against Texas A&M, possibly against LSU, as well as Ole Miss, and also possibly facing Georgia in the SEC championship. So certainly Alabama would have wiggle room to where they could lose another game, whether it's in the regular season or the SEC championship, and still make it. Florida State sitting at 7-0. I think they would be, if we were in a 12-team playoff, they would be a virtual lock at this point, just looking at their schedule within the ACC. Let's say they go undefeated and then lose. That's where it gets interesting, right? The problem with giving the conference champion a virtual bye, well, actually, I don't think that's going to matter next year, because I think we're doing away with divisions in a lot of these leagues. Yeah, I don't think that's going to matter. The issue would be if one of the divisions within a conference was horrible and that team wins, they would get in. It would be like Iowa winning the Big Ten West and then somehow winning the conference championship and getting in, right? Now, that's not going to happen because the Big Ten is doing away with that and they're expanding, and it's going to look completely different. But I'm just saying, this year in a hypothetical, it would be an issue. When you look at Florida State right now, certainly they could lose 1 game. I do think with how the ACC is, actually, maybe Florida State could probably lose 2 games. It would be an argument for sure if Florida State loses 2 games, because they have that non-conference win over LSU, because they have a win over Clemson, Duke. It's a decent resume. Would they be in even with 2 losses? I think it depends on, do they win their conference championship? What happens there? You do have Texas sitting at 6-1. They could probably suffer another loss because they've got that non-conference road win over Alabama. You have Georgia at 7-0. I think Georgia is a case where even in a 12-team format, and I know people will say you're crazy for this because Georgia's back-to-back national champion, they had such a horrible schedule so far, 7-0, really no key wins. I would not say beating Kentucky's a good win. If they were to lose a regular season game, let's say to Tennessee, and then lose to Alabama in the SEC championship, I would have them out of a 12-team playoff. They just don't have any good wins, in 2 losses. Certainly, you would make the argument, well, you look at their resume in terms of the last few years, but this is just based off of this year. It would be an interesting argument. LSU already has 2 losses. I think LSU, if they win out right now in the 4-team playoff, they would probably be in. But just in general, if it's a 12-team playoff, certainly LSU will probably try and make an argument even if they lost to Alabama, they should be in the playoff as a 3-loss team if they finish the regular season 9-3 because of their tough schedule and the tough non-conference game against Florida State, especially if Florida State ends up going undefeated. You do have Oregon with 1 loss. They would be in a great spot in terms of making the playoff for sure. It just depends on the Pac-12. They still have to face USC. They've still got a few other tough games. And then obviously the Pac-12 championship. If they ended with 2 losses, maybe losing to Washington twice, would they get in? It would be an argument. You can see Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame, if they wanted to get in a 12-team format right now with where they're positioned, they would have to go undefeated. So they would have to beat Clemson on the road. But pretty much all of their tough games are behind them outside of that Clemson game. And if they finish 10-2 with 1 loss coming to Ohio State, where Ohio State had to complete a 4th and 19 pass, I think Notre Dame would be probably in as a 10 or 11 seed. And then you do have Washington, who would sit in a great spot right now at 7-0, possibly, being able to at least lose 1, very likely 2 games and still make it depending on if they win their conference championship. Ole Miss would be in an interesting spot. Let's say Ole Miss finishes, goes undefeated the rest of the way. They finish 11-1, but they don't make the SEC championship because they don't have the tiebreaker over Alabama. They would very likely be in as an 11-1 SEC team who doesn't even make their conference championship. You would be looking at a Kansas State team. It would be very simple for Kansas State. If you win out from here, you're in the 12-team playoff, obviously, because you win your conference championship. You only have 2 losses. Very simple for them. A&M would pretty much be out of it at this point at 4-3. Tennessee it's looking very, I guess Tennessee could win out and they would be in as well. Maybe even they could make their conference championship game, lose, and possibly be in at 10-3, or would they be 9 maybe not, they would be 10-3, I think, at that point, because they would have a win against Georgia in the regular season. That would be an interesting argument. USC would have to win out. Clemson would have to win out. Oregon State is in an interesting spot. See, now we're letting more teams in. You're giving some of these lower schools a bigger chance. It would be pretty cool, guys. This is why the 12-team playoff is so awesome. There's so much more to talk about. Oregon State is sitting there with just the 1 loss inside of the FPI top 20. They would have a legitimate chance. Their fan base would be pumped up to make a 12-team playoff. North Carolina, even after their brutal loss, they still only have 1 loss. They can still win the ACC and be in. Miami sitting with 2 losses. They would have to have a lot of work to do. Utah would have a chance, but the Pac-12 is so tough. I see them dropping several games. And then when it comes to the group of 5 representative, I think right now it would come down to SMU, who analytically is the best. You have Air Force, who's the only undefeated team. And then you have Tulane, who was kind of the Cinderella story of last year. It would be those 3 teams, and then maybe Fresno State on the way outside looking in. But I would say right now, in terms of if we had a 12-team playoff this year, you would be looking at SMU versus Air Force. Those would be my 2 top teams, possibly from the group of 5 to make it. And if you are like a Power 5 team that's going to be in the playoff, possibly facing a group of 5, you would actually, I don't know. Facing Air Force is so annoying because they limit possessions, but at least analytically, you want to stay away from SMU. This is all hypothetical. Obviously, this is not happening. I'm just saying, in the event we actually had a 12-team playoff this year, I don't know if I would rather face Air Force because the triple option is so annoying, and you have to game plan for it. I think I'd rather face SMU, honestly. Maybe I'm too scared of the triple option, but it's just annoying with the clock running this year with the new rules. Either way, guys, it's something interesting to think about, and I do think the 12-team playoff, it's going to be great for the sport. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.